Thanks, everybody. I think we're ready. I think we're all set up and ready to go. Is this guy working? Okay. Yeah. It's a pleasure to welcome Pier Vittorio Aureli tonight to lecture at the A. Am I right, Pierre? This is the first lecture at the A. It's not often I get to say that in welcoming somebody, that's an opportunity for a first lecture here. It is for Pierre, and I think it's great to be able to do this now. I had the pleasure to come across Pier Vittorio for the first time a few years ago when I was teaching at the Berlage. I was invited by Pierre's thesis advisor on a final project he did at the Berlage. His advisor, Ilia Zengelis, and I think Pierre was probably one of Ilia's final students at the school, and is, of course, one of the great teachers of architecture in the 20th century. In fact, a tutor that shaped what we all know of as the diploma school here at this place a very long time ago, and had the ability to work across incredibly diverse ranges of ideas and in fact, teaching partners within the unit. Pierre is very much a product of the kind of culture of architecture that Ilia has always demonstrated within his teaching. I was invited to come in and see a project that Pier Vittorio worked on for a year that was really a remarkably unique European deconstruction of a European city, the city of Brussels, which he knows very well, in which he went through an analysis of the built mass and material of the city as the basis for a research project that just really stood out within particularly the context of that institution. Pier Vittorio's interest in the city and urbanism, which is quite deeply formed in his own approach to architecture, will form a backdrop for what he's going to be presenting tonight. And it's very much an interest that encouraged me to invite Pier Vittorio to come over this term to teach a History and Theory Studies course here at the AA. One of Pier Vittorio's deep interests lies not just in urbanism, but in this very peculiar generational reality of urbanism today, which is that it's a category of thinking that's almost fully untheorized or unproblematized in contemporary architectural discourses. I think one of the strange realities of contemporary architecture is that the issues of urbanism no longer play the kind of foundational role in the forming of architectural thinking and careers that they did for people a generation ago, when people like Venturi or Colin Rowe or Koolhaas write books on urban conditions that in effect form the basis for architectural careers. Those kind of three seminal texts from the 70s close for a generation the idea of urbanism as a topic that can be, in the words that Pier Vittorio sometimes uses, proactively theorized and not famously retroactively theorized in the thinking of someone like Koolhaas. That's where Pier Vittorio's interest lies today, as a kind of proactive rethinking of the city and urbanism. His talk tonight on the diagram sits with that as a kind of backdrop. It's the title for a lecture that I've been waiting for a few years, After the Diagram. And it's a title that we've played with as the basis for courses here in the last few years. Pier Vittorio beat us to it, and I think it's absolutely great. That title comes obviously after a decade of sustained thinking, questioning, and arguing about the status of the diagram around the world in architectural discourses, and obviously many people here, many units, many programs here have worked through the issues of the diagram, architecture, and urbanism in different ways. Before studying a master's degree at the Berlage Institute, Pier Vittorio studied architecture at the Institute for Architecture and Studies in Venice, in Italy. After that, he went to the Berlage, where he received his master's degree in architecture and where he now teaches. He directs the second-year research unit there and also teaches a studio or a unit at the school. He's this term a guest professor at the Accademia Mendrisio and also teaches at Delft University, and as of about a week and a half ago has completed his PhD on architecture, I think the first of the graduates at the PhD program at the Berlage, where he was grilled by people like Peter Eisenman and others who were deeply interested and engaged with the kind of topics that he's dealing with. It's a pleasure to welcome Pier Vittorio Aureli.
Thank you, Brett, for this overwhelming introduction. Actually, I want to a little bit apologize because the talk of tonight will be a little bit, if you want, idiosyncratic and also a bit personal. which come from, if you want, an accident of my life, which was to be almost, I would say, forced to go to study in the Netherlands when I finished my graduate studies in Venice. I mean, my idea was to do something completely different, was to become a historian. But my mentor, my teacher almost said, well, you really have to go to the Netherlands, you really have to get out from Venice and really somehow embrace what is today actually the contemporary condition of practicing architecture and architectural theory, which was the thing I was very, very interested. And one comes to the Netherlands, I mean, one have an impression to be almost in my own city, in Rome, in the 16th century, where all artists were going there to really face what actually was the ground zero of newness. And when you are in Rotterdam, you really have that feeling. I mean, there are people from all over the world really almost waiting a magic recipe to improve their own practice, their own kind of architectural intelligence. And when one studies there and teach there, and I have to say I really enjoy it to live there I mean, I'm still living there for a few years. One somehow have to accept certain codes, certain paradigms, a certain way of thinking about architecture and architectural theory. And to me, this was quite somehow kind of a new language. I mean, something that when I was studying in Venice was completely unknown. I mean, the language of what we call today research, which of course have a very, very specific meaning, and this specificity is quite recent. If one wants to summarize actually in one word how this, what we call research, is actually represented, this word is diagrams. And of course, for many of you, this word is nothing new, is nothing really shocking, but for me, who used to think about architecture in terms of plans, sections, and actually models or classing, let's say, traditional means of representation, the encounter with the diagram was really like the encounter with a new language, which actually forced me to be skeptical about it. I really want to agree with you on the meaning of the word skepticism. I mean, skepticism is not just to refuse completely to believe in something, but skepticism means that you, of course, you acknowledge the importance of a certain language, but at the same time, because your background, you're almost forced to analytically be detached from this language. Now, Wittgenstein once said that language, I mean, at the end of his career, I mean, he as you know, his philosophy was completely devoted to the problem of language as actually cognition of reality. And at the end of his career, he almost suggested that language was a camouflage of reality. And, well, my arguments, and especially, let's say, as I told you, this is a very personal argument. It comes from my also activity of teaching. And my argument is that often I see diagrams not only as a representation of reality or as a camouflage of reality, but really as a form of nihilism. A nihilism in a literal sense, as a kind of, if you want, deliberate consumption of reality as reality appears around us. Now, I want to say that I don't want to give a kind of, if you want, romantic or negative connotation to the word nihilism. I mean, we have to think nihilism not in a nihilistical way, if you want. I mean, I really would like to really focus this word in a very structural sense. I mean, something that is really implicit, if you want, in really how Western thought, in a way, theorize, how Western thought project. I mean, in this kind of moment of projection, a moment of creation, of becoming, this idea of reducing reality as appears, I mean, empirical reality into nothing, I mean, to really somehow overcome reality. It's a very structural aspect of our way of thinking. Nevertheless, of course, as all structural aspects of our, let's say, practice towards reality is also very problematic. Now, I would like to somehow criticize this. I would like to offer you a kind of point of view on this argument that diagrams somehow symbolize this incredible energy of consumption of reality, representation of reality, consumption of reality, and of course also problematic somehow detaching ourselves from reality. But somehow for me is an excuse to focus on certain structural way of thinking of our age that find in the locus of architecture a very, very crucial representation. That's why I think today architecture, even beyond itself, is a very important discipline, because in a way, in its own construction, its own theoretical construction really implies a certain vision of the world. And actually it's very interesting that the word theory means really vision. I mean, theory means really the representation of a clear, precise point of view. So the first context in which we have to see diagrams is postmodernism. When I talk to my students about postmodern, of course, they immediately refers to Charles Jencks, The Language of Postmodern Architecture, 1977, where Jencks actually almost, I would say, summarize, categorize the idea of postmodernism, especially referring to a style. Somehow he consumed something that for me is still very crucial and very present among us in an image. And of course, POMO, as architects we used to call postmodernism, is something that ends in a certain, let's say, period of time, and something that actually, as I said, we really associate with a particular language, with a particular style. And I have to say that the less interesting way in which one can represent the postmodern condition is especially architecture. Now, if one wants to really find a representation of postmodern that really goes beyond this kind of, if you want, image, stylistic consumption, for me, the most interesting way to find the seeds of postmodernism, and postmodernism really as a place where we can somehow situate a way of thinking reality through diagram, is actually literature and music. It's very interesting that between the 40s and 50s, there were certain groups, actually, especially two groups, Group 47 from Germany and Group 63 from Italy, who actually were the first groups to name themselves neo-avant-garde, a word that is still used today also within architecture to define let's say the generation, the avant-garde generation that came to the scene in the 60s. These groups actually were very much linked together by a certain consciousness that one of the most important keywords of their own time was the idea of change. The idea of change was for them actually the pure, let's say, the Weltanschauung through which we're considering a possible representation of the world. But change for them was a pure mechanism. Change was absolutely liberated from any theological way of thinking about reality. So if in modernity, or what we used to call modernity, change was a proactive act of reformation of reality, a kind of teleological way of thinking about reality. Teleological in this place means that you are aiming to something that is there, that have a goal. And for this generation of people, for the generation of the neo-avant-garde, change was a pure mechanism, was actually liberated from this kind of condition. Two leaders of these groups are well-known intellectuals. One is Heinrich Böll from Group 47 and Umberto Eco from Group 63. And actually, they were really insisting on the idea of change both as a free value becoming, as becoming that doesn't have any more a kind of projection towards which it aims, but is a mechanism in itself. And for them, this was really the foundation of what they would call a neo-avant-garde art or neo-avant-garde literature. So actually, around that time, a very important historian of music, Leonard Meyer, 1967, a little bit late, theorized a concept for me which actually really framed this problem of change, change as becoming liberated from any value. And he theorized this condition as probability of stasis. Now, stasis commonly means something that is stuck, that it stops. But it's not really a correct translation. Stasis have two meanings. One is, of course, a kind of moment of suspension. And suspension is not something totally stuck. Suspension is really something that is somehow is almost on the verge of evolving in something else, but at that moment is somehow in a kind of fluctuating stability. And the other idea is a political meaning, if you want. It means rebellion, unity, civil war. Actually, it's very used by a Greek historian Thucydides in his book, The History of Peloponnesian War. he really refers to the idea of stasis as a civil war, as something really actually opposite to the idea of polemos, which means the word polemos is where the word polemic comes from. Polemos was really a war between two different discernible parties, while stasis was really an internal war, where it was not, I mean, there was something happening, there was a change happening, but it was very difficult to discern the resolution of the change. I mean, an example of stasis is actually really the postmodern war, like, for example, the war in Iraq, where there is a kind of something going on with very drastic, let's say, moments of change, but we are not able anymore, I mean, our cognition is not able anymore to discern a clear resolution of what's going on. So for Leonard Meyer, this was actually the condition in which what he was calling a new modernity. He didn't use the word postmodernity, but he was using the word new modernity was somehow entering. And he really stated that change, if in modernity change was actually a moment of transition and reform, a teleological reform of reality, for Leonard Meyer change was a fluctuating stasis. So we can say that in the last 50 years, we have a moment of incredible change of our condition, but somehow this change has been never, I mean, as Brett said before, I mean, deeply theorized. I mean, the change has not been instrumentalized as a really cognitive reform in the way we are thinking about the world. So this change is very always recorded, very much present. I mean, you can't, I think, you can't open a book anymore about urbanism and architecture that in the first sentence doesn't say, well, the world in the last 10 years, the last 20 years, the world is enormous, has been changed completely. But this change, I mean, is so fast, is so, let's say, strong, that its own kind of cognition end up in this kind of fluctuating stasis, in something that is always moving, and because it's moving, it's stuck on this kind of, in this kind of somehow moments of stasis. Now, in a way, to say that this is a kind of phenomena of the last 50 years is not actually really entirely correct. I would say that this condition is something that really starts much time before, precisely at the moment where the idea of becoming, which is actually the essence of change, is somehow progressively liberated from any fundaments. And actually this moment is the French Revolution. And I would argue that postmodernism, in a way, started not in the 60s or 50s, but really started with the French Revolution. Now, this sounds very bizarre, but if you are a student of history and you go to a university and you enroll yourself in contemporary history, you will discover that contemporary history actually starts really from French Revolution. And what they call modern history stops with the French Revolution. So the French Revolution is really the transition from modernity to contemporaneity, to something that is after modernity. So the essence of this transition is when becoming, I mean, the idea of change is liberated from the idea of episteme. And if we really want to criticize the essence of diagrams, we really have to pay attention to this definition. I'm really sorry to make this detour, but I think it is really essential to really understand, let's say, what is behind actually the, if you want, pure critique of the diagram in itself. Now, one can say that becoming is actually, I mean, according to its own original definition, which is not a given. I mean, becoming is an invention of Greek thought, which arose for the first time with the invention of metaphysics. So becoming is, in a way, the essence of nihilism, the claims that something come out from nothing, and therefore, because its own constituency, can actually return to nothing and again. I mean, actually, this is actually the mechanism, according to Greek thought, that really produced the idea of change, the idea of becoming. I mean, when we project something, in our moment of projection, we produce something, but at the same time, we also consume something. And in this kind of moments, there is an implicit claim that something can be nothing at any moment, can, let's say, be created out of nothing, and can return to nothing as it was coming out of nothing. So this is actually why nihilism is not a bad word. I mean, it's not something that we have to regard as something, let's say, negative, but, well, it's problematic, of course, but it's really structurally, let's say, implicit in our way of thinking about the world, which actually, as I told you, arose for the first time with the invention of metaphysics, of something that is really beyond our physical reality. So the word episteme was actually a counteract to this condition. Episteme today is translated commonly as a science, but this translation is not really correct. Episteme, steme, was actually the decorated prow of the ship. You know, the boats have this ship, and there was always a kind of iron steel decoration in front of the ship, which was meant to really break through the waves of the sea. And actually, episteme, literally means standing above the waves of becoming. So for Greek thought, in order to really assess this problem of becoming, this condition of becoming, it was important that there was a kind of permanent truth. There was a kind of a clear moment where this, let's say, the anxiety of becoming was clashing against this kind of idea of episteme. The idea of, episteme means the will to know permanently the truth of the world. And of course, this was not, it was not something coming out of nothing. It was really a reaction to this problem that our way of thinking, our way of representing was constantly moving and constantly consuming through actually creation and becoming the world. And therefore, there was a need of something else, something that was counteracting this kind of phenomenology of thought. And this is precisely the idea of episteme. Now, with postmodernism, as I tried to conceptualize it before, we can say that contemporary becoming, actually, is a change liberated from the horizon of episteme. We have only pure change. We don't have anymore that kind of let's say, mental background through which we can really precisely assess change. So change is something that evolved in its own without any, let's say, background where you can really assess this kind of movement of change. And I think this condition is beautifully summarized by Nietzsche when he said that the world is an artwork that makes itself. And this, for me, is really the ground zero of postmodern thinking. It's something that creates itself without any more this, let's say, kind of external moment of action, this proactive external moment of pushing something in one direction. Now, it's very interesting that the moment actually we start to represent the world in these terms, new ways of representation of the city start to emerge. And this representation of the city were no longer dealing with form, but we're dealing with a new kind of substance, which was not anymore, that was transcending, if you want, the will of the architect, the will of the builder to form the city. This is actually really the beginning of what today, with a lot of nonchalance, we call urban space. Well, urban space, empirically speaking, space is actually the distance between 2 points. But urban space is a new, let's say, cognitive idea of the city, where form, actually, what is doable by our action, is not anymore important. Urban space is actually the interaction, a territorial interaction of different elements, different things, that cannot be defined anymore through form. And this is actually very much almost emerging with inventions such as electromagnetism, where actually there are flows, there are workings of, let's say, of elements such as networks that are not anymore reducible to clear formal representation. Also the development of modern cartography, where actually the city is not anymore represented in an empirical way through views, but is really represented through a very abstract projection. And of course, cartography has a very long history, but it's precisely at in the between of the 18th century that is really, the city is really scientifically mapped. Where science and not anymore representation, well, science itself become a form of representation, and of course science really constantly updates its own representation of the city. So science is something that almost substitutes the idea of episteme. There are not anymore fixed canonical way of representing the city, but with the advent of mediums such as electricity or electromagnetism or cartography, science itself is the new episteme. And science, I mean, one of the mechanisms of science is that science always change. I mean, science is not anymore, it's not something that is fixed like the previous episteme. It's very interesting that today we actually translate episteme as a science. I mean, as you know, Foucault is very clear about that. So, but actually, the moment where episteme is something fixed, something that really represents the city in a very, let's say, formal way, and the moment where the city is constantly represented in its own becoming is exactly at that moment. Now, for me, this is actually where the diagram enters. I mean, the moment where there is a need of new form of representations that are not anymore empirically intelligible, but they are abstraction of this process of becoming of the city itself. Now, for me, one of the most incredible example of this new, if you want, or this epistemological shift is the Nollie Map. Perhaps you know this famous map of Rome drawn by Giovan Battista Nollie in 1748, which actually is always, I mean, there are a lot of architects and urbanists that use this map as an example of a rhetoric about the city. Conley Rove used to say that this was a clear representation of figure ground urbanism. But I think that this interpretation, or there are more contemporary interpretations that see this as a kind of the representation of the difference between public space and private space, although at that time there was not really a definition of public space and private space. For me, actually the real problem of this map, that for the first time, in a very scientific manner, I mean, the Nollie Map is the first scientific mapping of Rome, and actually is one of the most more precise, accurate scientific mapping in the history of cartography. It's very interesting that Rome in 18th century was a very not anymore such important cities, but if it was important for one thing, which was actually the development of cartography. I mean, cartography was a very advanced science in Rome. And what this map shows for the first time is actually the difference between city and architecture. So architecture is represented in its own conventions. I mean, architecture is really drawn as a plan. I mean, all these churches and monuments, while the city is actually abstract as a kind of plan of tarmac. It became a kind of generic, let's say, footprint. Now, for us, this is very obvious. But at that time, if you compare this representation to previous representation of cities and to previous representation of form, this was a really big shock, because for the first time was breaking, the classic continuity between city and architecture. You know that Leon Battista Alberti used to say that to design a building and to design a city is basically the same thing. I mean, and that kind of way of thinking, that kind of continuity between city and architecture is really actually what we are still, in a way, having in our background. That's why we invented diagrams to really gap the bridge between these two representations. So for the first time, Nollie really put in crisis that let's say, way of thinking. So for Nollie, architecture was representable through its own form, while the city was this kind of abstract pattern. What is interesting that in order to render this map, he implied two totally different ways of measuring the city. The architecture was really represented through its own repeatable measure, so it was really empirically measure and draw. And actually, what is very interesting that one of the person who was helping Nollie in mapping the architectural part of the map was Piranesi, a young Giovan Battista Piranesi, while Nollie was mostly responsible for the black part. Nollie was not an architect. He was a scientist of measures. And he really, I mean, he totally abstract the city to this kind of diagram, if you want. I mean, what could be, let's say, a primordial diagrammatic representation, which for us looks very obvious, but at that time this kind of overlapping of these two layers was absolutely stunning and impressive. Now, it's very interesting that 12 years later, actually no, 14 years later, in 1762, Piranesi answered to that challenge. I mean, answered to the challenge of Nollie that were saying, well, the city is not anymore representable through form, through architecture, but only through this kind of new scientific methodology, which actually was represented with this black rendering. And Nollie countered that position with this very famous Campo Marzio, his own reconstruction of the imperial city in what actually at the time was the center of Rome. Now, The Campo Marzio, that I think you know very well, was introduced by this drawing, where Piranesi destroyed the whole city, actually the whole black, if you want, part of Nollie, and he only, let's say, left few monuments, which were the monuments of ancient Rome that was existing at that time. And from this, let's say, archipelago of urban artifacts that are represented in a very empirical way, I mean, Piranesi goes back actually to this kind of birth view approach to the city. So he refused this kind of, in first instance, this kind of abstraction of Nollie. And then from this kind of conjecture, where he really actually materially destroyed the city, I mean, the Campo Marzio was not pure fantasy. It was really almost a latent, I mean, a project of reconstruction of Rome. Piranesi hated the Baroque Rome. I mean, the city was evolving from 16th century to 17th century. Really was dreaming to reconstruct the city according to the principle of the imperial architecture. And from this conjecture, he reconstructs the whole city. But what you can see, actually, this reconstruction was very precise because he was mapping this existing quite precisely, also because he learned that the scientific technique from Nollie. In this reproduction, you cannot see very well, but there are certain parts which are more dark than others, which were the existing fragments existing at that time. And through this kind of, let's say, archipelago, was then reconstructing the whole supposed imperial city. And what Piranesi is doing is actually trying to represent the whole city only by means of architecture. So he's refusing this kind of abstraction, and he's still using the conventions of architecture to represent the city. So this Nollie is the last, if you want, desperate attempt to still see the city as a product of architecture. I mean, where actually the formal accuracy of architecture is able to reconstruct the city, and he ended up in a city which is made only by architecture, where there are not any more streets. I mean, what actually was very, very visible and present in the Nollie map. Now, it's very interesting that this kind of problem of representation of the city was very much pushing architects who were very much believing also in form, such as Le Corbusier, in considering the diagram as, at the end, the only way of representing the city itself. At the end of the book of the Radiant City, Le Corbusier said that the truth is in the diagrams, and to place, I mean, to really see the truth in the diagram that we first see, we were discussing the idea of truth as a kind of something that is fixed. Well, now the truth is identifying something that always changes, that always record in real time. For Le Corbusier was really to place theory back to its own true frame. So from that moment on, I mean, when actually architects recognized that there was a difference, as Nollie was representing, between city and architecture, actually the diagram, even for Le Corbusier, was very much confident with architectural form. Diagram itself was actually the true frame of theory, of representation of the city through architecture. But, and actually this is also very, very crucial for all the architects that came after Le Corbusier, who actually, as Le Corbusier, were very interested in representing the city through architecture. More and more architectural form was not anymore able to actually express this representation, and new definitions and new concepts start to emerge, like, for example, the idea of network, which was for the first time really theorized by Konstantinos Doxiadis in 1963 with the Delos paper, where he actually really saw the web. He was really using, in a very naive way, the spider web. Doxiadis was a very interesting person, very naive, but extremely visionary. And I have the feeling that he was really the last, I mean, Doxiadis' work was really the last theory about the city. I mean, the last attempt to really put forward something that we are today only basically repeating, maybe with more sophisticated way of representation. Nevertheless, for Doxiadis, form was no longer, let's say, something that, or let's say architectural form was no longer able to represent the contemporary world. And so you have the emergence of these new forms of representations that are totally beyond architecture. But what is very curious, that precisely at the time, we are in the 60s, a little bit before, in the 50s, the diagram from a means of representation that is beyond architecture, that really goes beyond what architecture can represent, in a way feeds back to architecture itself. Now, one of the first moments in which this happened is Wittkower book, Architectural Principle in the Age of Humanism, where he started to say, I mean, he really claimed in the introduction of the book that he tried to describe a Renaissance architecture not through a series of, let's say, episodes, but he's trying to recognize a certain continuity through these episodes that can be represented through what he really called a diagram. Now, this is very important because this book have an enormous influence not only on actually architects such as Peter Eisman, who actually really were somehow very interested to use this device to actually construct their own architecture, but also to different architects such as the Smithsons. And the Smithsons were very much influenced by Wittkower book, which was published in 1949. They acknowledged this many times. And actually, I think that their use of diagrams really come from the reading of this book. Because actually what Wittkower was, Wittkower was a very, if you want, idealistic person. I mean, he really wants to somehow see in architecture almost the kind of representation of something that was really beyond architecture. And so he's really concerning with diagrams, was really to somehow to not see architecture as a kind of collection of very different separate episodes, but really as the construction of a kind of collective cognitive way of thinking about architecture. So for him, the diagram was really the representation of this. So from an instrument that represents the city that is, let's say, beyond architecture, the diagrams, let's say, feeds back in architecture itself. And of course, Conley Rove was very much using that technique. And what actually started to emerge as a way of using the diagram is a kind of cinematic, let's say, way of scanning architecture. So with Conley Rove, you don't have anymore just a plan, but you have a series of diagrams, a series of drawings that almost in a cinematic way represent the becoming, the evolution of architectural form. And this, of course, is really the origin of how we are practicing diagrams. I mean, with diagrams, we really almost try to get rid of this kind of uniqueness, singularity of one drawing, of one plan, or one section, or one form, and we transcend that singularity in this kind of attempt to represent the becoming of that form that nevertheless is fixed. And of course, there were also different ways of using diagram, but still with this kind of idea of transcend the fixity of architecture. These are the famous bubble diagrams done by graduate students at Harvard. I always show this to my students because I think this is really the ancestors of many diagrams people are still doing today, where actually, let's say, the architecture itself became a ghost, and what you have is really this kind of mold that is supposed to form architecture, which is movement. But what is interesting, at a certain point, what is supposed to counter the fixity of architecture, movement, as is represented in this diagram, become the architecture itself. If you take, for example, Peter and Alison Smithson Berlin-Hauptstadt project, which for me is really the first urban project where the diagram became a kind of form, architectural form, you see how the diagram of the network, I mean, what actually the Smithsons were really putting forward as a new palimpsest of architectural, the architectural vision of the city, is almost frozen. It became really an architecture itself. And in a way, megastructure, it's really this. I mean, megastructure is almost a frozen, let's say, version of the diagram. I mean, the diagram itself became an artifact. And of course, this for me is very much clear in one of, I think, very crucial project, Tokyo Bay project by Kenzo Tange, where the 0 degree of its own formal composition is a pure diagram, is a diagram of a plug-in system. I mean, you have the idea that you have a central core, and then to this core you have this kind of capsule that are plugged in. So the project, I mean, the form of the city itself became an abstraction, became a diagram. What is interesting that Tange developed the project within the surface of the sea, really to isolate this project from the rest of the sea, to really show that how the translation of diagram into architecture was really requiring this new total abstraction, this kind of consumption of previous form of architecture, and how somehow this new, let's say, representation of the city through architecture was able in one sweeping gesture to completely reshape the entire island of Japan. The idea of Tange was really to extend the whole project gradually to the whole island of Japan. And so you see how the whole territory is gradually reshaped by this kind of principle that Tange was able to formalize in this amazing project for Tokyo. But in this, let's say, evolution, you really see the problem of diagram. I mean, from an instrument to really somehow embrace complexities that are beyond the phenomenology of architectural form, diagram become a very totalizing moments of representation, which constantly somehow is reshaping reality even beyond the possibilities of reality itself, to the point that diagrams are really becoming almost autonomous from actually what they are meant to project and represent. And of course, here we are still in a moment where diagrams are devices, where diagrams are really kind of proactive gestures that try to restructure the city. But today, diagrams are icons. I mean, we produce diagrams not anymore as a kind of moment of understanding how reality itself can be forced and reinvented, but diagrams itself are just pure autonomous representation. For me, the most interesting moment is when we can say that, in a way, architectural form is less and less important, but architectural thinking, I mean, this kind of nihilistic will to always reinvent the world beyond the possibility of the word itself and thus consuming the word itself is really summarized in this statement by Colas, where he said, liberated from the obligation to construct, I mean, construct not to build, but construct, architecture can become a way of thinking about anything, disciplines that represent the diagram of everything. Now, for me, this is really the moment where the diagram is really this, I mean, it's having its own kind of constitution, this kind of, let's say, possibility, but also danger to totally consume what is meant to represent, and therefore to be kind of a change ex nihilo, a change that doesn't have anymore the subject, the object that it wants to change. But there is also another problem, how somehow this, let's say, is this kind of evolution of the diagram is reaching a kind of conclusion where more and more, let's say, reality, I mean, I use the word reality, which is, of course, a very tricky word in the way Machiavelli was defining reality as the effectual truth. I mean, how things are appearing, how our feelings are somehow approaching what is around us. And actually, this is really the moment where this moment of representation, I mean, how architecture can really somehow spread itself to this kind of value-free becoming, where it's implicit this moment of nihilism, this moment of just consumption. So we constantly update our maps, we constantly update our representations, but this updating, this change is constantly detaching, alienating itself in the Marxist sense of the word, alienating itself from the moment of friction between theory and reality, between projection and reality. And of course, this in a way creates a problem really in the core of what the diagram was meant to somehow provide, which is the moment of decision making, the moment of taking a decision, the moment to represent, to legitimize where the idea, where I mean, what actually change is meant to say. I mean, how things can be projected into something completely different. And actually, it's very interesting that diagrams more and more became almost bounded diagrams. I mean, one of the things that I realized, especially working with my students, that they don't anymore represent the diagrams as a kind of just unique moment of representation of one option, of one possibilities. But they start to somehow collect a series of diagrams, and only through this kind of series of negotiation between different diagrams, you can somehow have a conclusion about something which is always postponed by this kind of sequence of diagrams. Now, the origin of this idea of bounded diagrams, I mean, the fact that the project is deconstructed by this kind of endless series of diagrams that never, let's say, focus the attention on one conclusive moment, a moment of azzardus, the moment of form, is again coming from Wittkower. I mean, Wittkower, if you take his book, he never shows the plan in one singular shot. He always make this kind of comparison, this sort of comparative analysis where what emerges is something that goes beyond architectural form, and this is kind of DNA, kind of, let's say, invisible DNA that inform this intelligence, but nevertheless is not actually representable through actually the empirical evidence of form. And Bitcover is really insisting on this moment of transcending the singular moment of form. And of course, Eisenman's way of representing his project is very much going that direction. I mean, with Eisenman, you never have one drawing, one project, but you always have this kind of series of this evolution through bounded diagrams. Again, this attempt really to consume the being of architecture, which is actually always embodied in form, in this kind of almost nihilistic representation of becoming, which doesn't start from somewhere, it doesn't end to some kind of clear conclusion. And of course, you can see also in more contemporary representations where, like Alejandro Zaera, and you can almost have sort of continuity between Bitcover, Eisenman, Zaira-Paul, although I mean the subject of the representation is completely different. Nevertheless, you always have this attempt to establish this intelligence, this form of intelligence that is transcending actually the empirical evidence of form, that is almost consuming form in these kind of endless variations of form itself. What is interesting is that, in a way, this idea of let's say, transcending, consuming the being of architecture is not something that is only, let's say, part of the, or let's say, a prerogative of the avant-garde itself. Even an architect like Aldo Rossi, who is also regarded as a kind of a background, if you want, of this evolution, within the idea of typology, was very much theorizing something that could be associated with a diagram. In Rossi, the idea of typology was not a fixed object, was not a fixed form, but was the attempt to record a certain form of intelligence that was beyond form or models in themselves. So for him, the evolution of the city could only be assessed by typology, namely something that was really beyond the substance of the city itself. In a way, actually, Rossi was very much influenced by the French school of urban geography, which was actually very influenced by Bergson. And Bergson, as you know, is a philosopher that really updates very much the definition of becoming with the idea of durée, the idea of something that really transcends what is, I mean, let's say, the division between time and space. And for Rossi, typology was really meant to represent this condition. It's very interesting that in his early drawing, we of course read the architecture of the city through his later projects. But when he was writing the architecture of the city, he was making these kind of drawings, which were really, he was really attempting to represent this kind of intelligence that was transcending the evidence of form, of empirical form. So for me, this is actually really what is the power and the problem of the diagram. So on one hand, the diagram is somehow acknowledging a certain complexity that really goes beyond the architectural form, that really goes beyond something that is empirically there. But at the same time, it also is a form of idealism that really projects ourselves to something that is progressively alienated from, let's say, the problem of reality as reality appear to us. So in that sense, I think that my idea of an after diagram is not, of course, the discards of diagrams, because this would just, let's say, fuel this problem of stasis, the idea that we constantly change without really digesting things, without really to deeply theorize things, but we just, let's say, go to another chapter without really to absorb the structural background of this practice. But for me, the after diagram is precisely, to, as I said at the beginning, to be skeptical, to really see this as a semi-autonomous representations that, while they are attempting to represent something that goes beyond actually reality as it appears to us, are also, let's say, arbitrary ideological representations. The diagram cannot be seen only as a given, almost a kind of natural, let's say, representation of something, but should always be a kind of moment, ideological moment, in which we really project, and therefore we reduce, we annihilate reality within, let's say, one idea, with one, let's say, idea of the world, and idea of the world that can even goes beyond what is almost, let's say, neutralized as intelligence. And I think that in that context, diagram should almost be ideogram in a way that should always somehow not only represent but also establish an idea of the word in a deep meaning of their own, let's say, constituency, in the deep meaning of their own, let's say, evolution. Thank you very much.
Take a few questions. I get a microphone. Thanks, Pierre. Can we take some questions? I'll give people a couple of minutes while they warm up to the task. Maybe just to pick up on one point, to try and connect the discourse on the diagram back to the question of urbanism and the realities of urban theory today. I'm struck with the shift towards an episteme and an epistemological project, even in the scientific sense, that there would be a will not for change's sake, but towards something, which I suppose could also be argued as a return to a kind of modern project which has, and I guess the question would be, a set of principles, goals, ambitions that are articulated in some way as foregrounding then the projects that come after. And I guess the question would then be what's the basis for those principles or projects today, and where might they lie beyond just the projects that people do within the city?
Yeah. Well, I think you are right in saying that the latent ambition of this critique is to reinforce the awareness that there is a need of going back. I don't like the word going back, but to reappropriate a certain modern, if you want, attitude. I just want to say, to precise that the word modernity, modern, comes from the Latin word modernus, which was used for the first time in the 5th century BC to identify the early Christians. So in a way, the idea of modernity, comes from this etymological origin. And modernus means modus. Modus, I mean, like modus operandi, a way of doing things. And I mean, it was associated with the early Christians because the early Christians were proactively choosing a totally different way of doing something. And therefore, they have this kind of, I mean, they were identified with this idea of modus. I mean, the choice of a totally different system of values through which to actually represent or believe in the world. So the idea of modernity is really, if you want, this moment of dogmatic beginning, where you really, dogma means a doctrine without proof. So without a proof, you really decide to change and to assume a radically different position. And in that sense, I think that for me, before to give a content to this attitude, we have to reconsider the attitude in itself. I mean, the modus, the way how theory, it was produced before. And actually, I see my critique on the diagram not as something, let's say, in order to get rid of diagrams, but almost as a therapeutic attitudes to reinforce the fact that the diagram is sometimes an optical illusion, where this moment, this hazardous of form, this hazardous of a choice, is always postponed and is always not really sharp in its own, even if you want, tragic, apocalyptic moment of choice.
I'm thinking, in light of the argument you're making about Piranesi's version of Rome as a counter to Nollie's, that then what you seem to also then be offering are terms for in fact categorizing diagrams in ways that are slightly unexpected. I'm thinking of work like Archizoom or Superstudio, which provides diagrams of the modern city which are very different than the kind of network bias of a Smithson project, that in fact do to the modern city what Piranesi seems to be doing to Rome in a classical sense, starting from ground zero, the sort of tabula rasa of Archizoom slabs across the city that are anything but a kind of network, they're just a restarting.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if one of the possibilities then that you're opening up is the idea that diagrams suddenly can be differentiated from one another and not just a sort of generic term that applies across entire generations of work.
Yeah, of course. There are, let's say, well, for me, I think you pick up very good examples because Archizoom, No Stop City share the same, let's say, approach to Piranesi. I mean, they represent the project only with one, let's say, drawing. Of course, these drawings are always different, but they are not, let's say, idealization of, of the thing itself, but it's really the thing itself in its own literal, almost. In fact, I mean, also that the drawing have a certain aggressive, almost attitude toward us. I mean, it's not postponing that the moment where the city is reduced to this kind of, absolute tabula rasa. So in that sense, I think that for me, both Piranesi's Campo Marzio and Archizoom No Stop Cities are not really what today we can consider diagrams. I mean, they are not creating that kind of intelligence through the, let's say, the recording of the becoming of the plan itself. There are only one drawing. I mean, I always actually shows this early sketch of Branzi, of No Stop City, to my students to say, he just make this project with one plan. I mean, like the Campo Marzio is only one plan. It's not like, these endless diagrams through which we construct our research. There is only one drawing. And that's for me very interesting. That's, I would say, is really the modern approach. That's with one, let's say, clear direction, you are able to put forward an idea. But at the same time, you're aware that that kind of moment of conjecture will never cover the entire possibilities of the city. I mean, in that sense, you are aware that you are really putting yourself in a very partial and very, let's say, singular position. Well, this is very different how, for example, Colas or Doxiadis are using diagrams, where they really try to represent everything. I mean, they really try to somehow embrace, in a kind of Hegelian way, the whole totality of the world.
Questions?
I enjoyed the lecture very much, and I particularly enjoyed the way you, in a sense, quite carefully tiptoed around the issue of the concept drawing, and the way in which the concept drawing shares a certain territory with the diagram in terms of staging and episteme, which the kind of FOA's use of the phylogenesis is just, in a sense, repeating. And so I'm kind of, want to know why that, and to what extent do you see the latter-day diagram, Rose diagram, just as simply as a reincarnation of the concept drawing of earlier moments of modernism?
I think that that kind of continuity is really in what I identify with the problem of nihilism. I mean, for me, I have problems with this concept, because the first time I try to argue this kind of, that the essence of the diagram is basically the essence of nihilism. I mean, a lot of people are really reacting in a very negative way. They say, this is really, it's not really a nice way to approach the problem. But for me, nihilism is something very structural. I mean, it's something that really, without nihilism, we would not have history. I mean, and actually, this is also the reason why Western thought, if you want, I'm going to say something very politically incorrect, almost won over other culture. I mean, Clement Greenberg once said that in fact, instead of talking about globalization, we should talk about the westernization of the whole world. And the reason why I'm insisting in this continuity, in this kind of repetition of the early, instead of looking to what the diagrams are representing that always change, I'm trying to see the structural condition through which the diagrams are produced in order to really identify this line of continuity, which for me never, let's say, change from the early example of let's say, diagrams to actually Alejandro or Greg Lynn, let's say, use of diagrams. Is this moment of idealization of the word, where you acknowledge both the complexity of the word and you consume the word through this kind of very simple, direct representations. And this, for me, really the essence, I would say, of Western thought, of the historicity of Western thought, of metaphysics. This is actually, if you want, really something I can't really articulate myself. I mean, something that really goes beyond my knowledge and my competence as an architect. But I believe that there is a continuity that we have to address, and even beyond, let's say, the specific understanding of diagrams within architectural culture. I don't know if I answered to your question or...
I mean, to some extent you did. I'm in the light of what you just said, I would kind of put forward the idea that actually these diagrams are the currency of the construction of that culture.
Yes.
It's more important to these architects to produce the diagrams than it is to produce the buildings. And in that way, they are highly rhetoricized, partly fictitious events always.
Absolutely, absolutely. But there is one, I mean, when I start my PhD, I mean, my PhD was, is about a crazy idea which I call the possibility of an absolute architecture. I mean, and I started the PhD really trying to say, I really want to go back to architectural form, I mean, as form objects, and to get rid of this kind of virtualization of form, this kind of diagrammatic representation. And towards the end of my thesis, I realized that my first hypothesis was extremely naive in a way. Why? Because architecture, I mean, first of all, there is a difference between building and architecture. Architecture as such is something that starts, let's say, at the end of 15th century, beginning of 16th century, in the moment where we start to have authorship for architecture. I mean, before, for example, Gothic architecture, we don't have authorship. We don't have a singular architect build. I mean, we don't have the author of buildings. It's from the 15th century on that we have singular authors that are, you know, manifesting their own personality, with their own style, their own manner with a building. And it's very interesting that the moment this figure emerged, I mean, Anthony Blunt described this in his own book, which I don't remember the title, this book, Theory in Renaissance, something like that. This coincides with the beginning of the age of printing. And in fact, at the beginning of my thesis, I thought that the absolute of architecture was form, but in fact, the absolute of architecture is the book. It's actually representation. I mean, all great architects, from Palladio to Colas, they are important because the book. So the moment of representation, I mean, the moment of the abstraction of architecture to representation is really actually what characterizes architecture. So that's why I said before we have a paradox, that on one hand, architectural form is less and less important, but the architectural way of thinking, of abstracting reality, is more and more important. The problem is that this kind of what Marx would call real abstraction that we are producing through architecture, for me, is becoming too problematic. Because actually the intelligence of diagrams, they don't have anymore the friction of architecture as matter. I mean, and to me, theory, I mean, architecture, the real architectural theory always comes from the conflict between, let's say, empirical, the effectual truth and the imagination of things. And this is actually what today contemporary diagrams are totally missing. I mean, they are pure imagination. I mean, in a way, they are the realization of the 68 power to imagination.
I enjoyed it also very much, and one of the things that I enjoyed most about what you've done is to open up so many potential events for us to think about. And I'm struck, in fact, by the extent to which your talk is almost populated by events. Now, in that sense, then it became curious for me, because there are a couple of books that come close to touching on the topic you've dealt with, where in a way it's almost like you sidestepped these other events. So I just wanted to ask you about them a little bit. Like, for example, you know, it seems that in a way, if we string along some of your events, we've got the Nollie Piranesi event, and it's an interesting dialogue, and all of your events are structured around this kind of dialogue or dispute about what you can achieve by working through the diagram. And starting in a way, in a similar way, Francois Chouai sort of starts with the same time period and then says it breaks down until we get urbanism in the 1860s. Yeah. And then Hyung-Moon Pai sort of says, well, we don't really have the diagram, we have something else. We have form and representation till we start to lose confidence in its ability to represent human order for us in a way. And so then with Ackerman and Mumford and others, then we get the diagram in the 20th century. In a way, you don't follow either Shuai or Hyungmin Pai, but instead see a series of other dialogues. Was that a kind of conscious choice not to engage with them?
Yeah, actually, it's very, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, this was a very idiosyncratic personal presentation because, in a way, it's really coming from my own. I graduated in urbanism. I didn't graduate as really as an architect, but really as an urban planner, and I also did my first doctorate in planning. And my dissatisfaction with urbanism was coming from the fact that, urbanists and planners hate architects. Françoise Choez is a very good example.
Yeah.
I like her a lot. I mean, she's a great person, but she really hates architects. Now, I realize myself, and actually planners, I mean urbanists, they are always claiming that, we can only talk about urbanism from 18th, let's say, half of 18th century on. Before there is not such a thing like urbanism. Nevertheless, my idea, coming actually from a planning background, is that often the imagination of the city itself is not produced by planning and urbanism, which really remain often a diagram or something very abstract, but is really produced by architectural image. Somehow, sometimes architecture is able to put forward, because it's empirically evident, our own cognition of the city itself. And that's why I was trying to show this in the lecture, the emergence of this cognition of the city, but how architects somehow started to realize that. And for me, the dispute between Piranesi and Nollie, which is a dispute between, let's say, not an architect, a scientist of measures, and an architect, is really the prototypical moments where this conflict between these two different ways of representing the city is emerging. And I really try to argue that, of course, less and less, more and more architecture was less important. Nevertheless, these kind of representations like Nollie Map or Campo Marzio are very important for us to understand anyway how the meaning of the city evolved. So in that sense, I was trying to react against my own background, which was very much of let's say, skepticism towards architectural representation. But I realized that more and more, especially today, that architectural representation is very much contributing to our understanding of the city.
Thanks. Any more, maybe time for one more question? Does anybody have? Then we'll stop there. Pierre, Vittorio, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.